There are decisions that change the course of an entire life. Decisions that haunt us through dark nights, that return when we least expect them, when we believe we've escaped their consequences. This is the story of a man who had everything: money, prestige, power. But who forgot the most important thing. He forgot that every life has the same value, regardless of the thickness of a wallet. He forgot that destiny has memory, and that unpaid debts are always collected. Today I bring you a tale born in the golden fields of rural Tennessee, where two boys swore eternal friendship beneath an ancient oak tree, where the years and ambition built an abyss that seemed impossible to cross. A story about the justice that the universe reserves for those who believe money can buy everything, even conscience. I invite you to join me on this journey that will remind us that no man stands above the laws of destiny. That life has mysterious ways of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn. And at the end, I'd love to know your opinion. Can a man redeem himself after committing the unforgivable? Leave your answer in the comments. Now then, let's begin the story that will change how we see justice. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, where the sun bathes ancestral farmland and the wind whispers secrets through cornfields, stretched the Hope Valley Ranch. It wasn't just any property, but one of the oldest and most prosperous in the entire region. Its lands encompassed miles of crops that fed hundreds of families. Its owner, Mr. Arthur Mason, was a respected man whose surname had been writing the history of that land for decades. Mr. Arthur had an only son named Richard, born from his marriage to a woman from a distinguished Nashville family. The boy grew up surrounded by privileges few could imagine: private tutors, trips across America and Europe, refined education. But Mr. Arthur, a man with principles rooted in the land, didn't want his son to grow up disconnected from the reality of the ranch he would someday inherit. For this reason, from an early age, Richard shared the classrooms of the ranch's rural school with the workers' children. There he met Thomas Harper, son of Mr. Arthur's most loyal foreman. Thomas was a boy with clear eyes and an honest smile, with hands already weathered from helping his father with ranch work. Although their worlds were as different as day and night, something profound united them from the first moment. The friendship between Richard and Thomas flourished like oak trees under the Tennessee sun. Together they explored every corner of Hope Valley, learned to ride horses, hid among the cornfields to share secrets. Under the shade of an ancient oak tree that dominated the highest hill, the two boys made an oath. They would be friends forever, soul brothers that nothing and no one could separate. The teenage years arrived with their dreams and aspirations. Richard, fascinated by science and moved by the desire to help, dreamed of studying medicine. He wanted to return to his land as a doctor, to care for the people he had grown up knowing. Thomas, for his part, dreamed of becoming an agricultural engineer, of modernizing farming techniques and making the land yield more fruit. One summer afternoon, sitting under their oak tree, Richard shared his plan. "I'm going to Nashville, Thomas. To the university. I'll study medicine and come back as a doctor." His eyes shone with the hope of the future. Thomas smiled, though there was melancholy in his expression. "And I'll stay here, learning from my father. Someone has to take care of these lands while you're gone." "You could come with me," Richard insisted. "My father could help you study too." But Thomas shook his head. "Your father is generous, but he has his limits. Besides, my place is here. This land is my destiny, Richard. But you were born for bigger things." When the time came for departure, Mr. Arthur sent Richard to the best universities. First Nashville, then Boston, later brief stays at hospitals in New York and Chicago. The young man drank from the fountains of the most advanced medical knowledge in America. But with each year spent in the cities, something in him was changing. The humble boy who had run barefoot through the fields began transforming into a man who measured success in titles and prestige. Letters between the friends became less frequent. Richard was busy building himself a brilliant future. Thomas, meanwhile, married Sarah, a woman from town with a sweet smile and noble heart. In 1982 their son Michael was born, a boy with lively eyes who inherited his father's nobility and his mother's tenderness. When Dr. Richard Mason returned to Tennessee in 1990, he was no longer the same. He arrived as a brilliant physician, with specialization in surgery and a reputation that preceded him. Mr. Arthur, proud of his son, provided him with the necessary capital to build a private hospital in the city near Hope Valley. Mason Memorial Hospital quickly became the most modern in the entire region, equipped with cutting-edge technology and a first-rate medical team. The first years, Richard was the doctor he had dreamed of being. He treated rich and poor alike. He visited the ranch regularly, asked about the workers' families, genuinely cared about their well-being. He even sought out Thomas on several occasions, eager to reconnect with his childhood friend. But the encounter was cold and distant. Thomas, who had followed Richard's trajectory from afar, noticed the change in his old friend. There was no longer warmth in his gaze, only a formal courtesy that hurt more than open rejection. Richard treated him with kindness, yes, but as one treats a valuable employee, not as a soul brother. That wound led Thomas to move to the city with his family in 1994, seeking distance from the pain of seeing what their friendship had been and what it now was. In the city, Thomas found work in construction. It wasn't prestigious, but it allowed him to support his family with dignity. Sarah worked cleaning houses. Michael, already a brilliant teenager, studied with a determination that amazed his parents. The boy worked during the day as a helper at the construction workshop where his father labored, and at night attended classes to become an accountant. "Someday I'll work in an office, Dad," Michael would say with eyes illuminated by dreams. "I'll give you a better life. I promise." While the Harper family struggled day by day to get ahead, Richard Mason continued his ascent. But something dark had begun growing inside him. Ambition, that silent worm that devours the soul, was slowly consuming him. The businessmen with whom he associated constantly spoke to him about profit margins, profitability, how the sentimental ended up in ruin. Mr. Arthur observed these changes with growing concern. In 1995, already elderly and ill, he called his son to his bedside. "Richard, my son," he said with weak voice, "don't let money change you. Remember where you come from. Remember that we were all equal once." But Richard was no longer listening. His mind was on numbers, on profits, on expanding his medical empire. When Mr. Arthur died in 1996, Richard inherited Hope Valley and a considerable fortune. He hired managers to administer the ranch and focused completely on his hospital, implementing increasingly restrictive policies. The policy at Mason Memorial Hospital became brutal in its efficiency. Without demonstrable payment capacity, there was no treatment. Richard fired doctors and nurses who showed too much compassion. Once, a veteran nurse tried to help a poor family with medical assistance forms. Richard called her to his office and told her coldly, "Do you think this is a charity hospital? This is a business, and businesses have no room for sentimentality." The nurse, Ellen, had been working there for almost 20 years. She had seen the hospital born, had witnessed how Richard changed year after year. That day, looking him in the eyes, she saw a stranger where once there had been a man with a soul. "Dr. Mason," she said with sadness, "you've lost the only thing that makes a true doctor, your humanity." Richard fired her on the spot. Mason Memorial Hospital's reputation was paradoxical. Medical excellence for those who could pay, certain death for those who couldn't. Poor families learned to avoid it. They preferred to travel miles to overcrowded public hospitals rather than face the humiliation of Richard's rejection. In his luxurious office, surrounded by diplomas and awards, Richard felt triumphant. At 45 years old, he was one of the richest men in Tennessee. He had properties in Nashville and Memphis. His hospital was the most profitable in the entire region. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. But he had forgotten something fundamental. The universe keeps a meticulous record of our actions, and sooner or later, it presents the bill. The night of March 15, 2005 would be the beginning of the end. That night, Michael Harper, Thomas's son, was walking down Main Street after finishing his construction shift. He was 23 years old, just months away from graduating as an accountant. His future shone before him like a golden promise. At 7:45 p.m., a sports car driven by a drunken young millionaire struck him at full speed. The impact was devastating. Michael was thrown several meters, his body hitting the pavement with brutal violence. The driver, protected by his family's money, fled without stopping. He would never be caught. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They assessed the injuries. severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, massive internal hemorrhage. He needs immediate surgery, said the lead paramedic. Mason Memorial Hospital is 10 minutes away. It's his only chance. Michael was loaded into the ambulance, unconscious, bleeding, fighting for every breath. The paramedics worked frantically as the ambulance cut through the night with its sirens. "Hang on, son," one of them murmured. "Hang on a little longer." At 8:05 p.m., the ambulance arrived at Mason Memorial Hospital. The emergency doors opened. Michael Harper was urgently carried inside, his life hanging by an increasingly thin thread. And it was Ellen, the nurse Richard had fired years earlier and who now worked there again out of necessity, who received him at the emergency entrance. She saw the young man's shattered body, saw his worker's clothes, saw that he carried no identification or documents. And she knew, with her heart sinking, exactly what would come next. Ellen quickly connected the basic monitors. The numbers on digital screens told a terrible story. Blood pressure 85/55 and falling, heart rate 125 and erratic, oxygen saturation 86%. Every passing second was one less second of life for this young man lying unconscious on the gurney. "He needs emergency surgery," Ellen murmured, her years of experience immediately recognizing the severity. "He needs transfusions. He needs a surgeon right now." She knew what she had to do, though she also knew what it would cost her. She ran to Richard's office. She found him reviewing financial figures on his computer, smiling satisfied at numbers projecting another record year of profits. "Dr. Mason," Ellen entered breathlessly. "There's a patient in critical condition. Hit by a car. Traumatic brain injury. Massive internal hemorrhage. Multiple fractures. If we don't operate in the next few minutes, he'll die." Richard didn't even look up from his screen. With a tone mixing boredom and irritation, he asked, "Documentation? Medical insurance? Deposit?" "He's unconscious. He's not carrying anything. It's a life or death emergency, doctor. He has less than 10 minutes. Richard finally looked up. His eyes were cold, empty. The eyes of a man who had learned to see people as economic categories. "Ellen, you know the hospital policy. Without payment documentation, without insurance, without money, there's no treatment. It's not cruelty. It's business realism." "Doctor, this boy is dying." Ellen's voice trembled with contained rage. "Right now, as we speak, his heart is failing. You're a physician. Your oath was to save lives." Richard leaned back in his leather chair. "My oath is toward the sustainability of this institution. Toward my investors. If you continue allowing your feelings to interfere with hospital policies, you'll be looking for another job tomorrow morning." Ellen stood there trembling. She had a sick brother who depended on her medical insurance. She couldn't lose this job. But as she turned to leave, something inside her broke. It was the part of her that had wanted to be a nurse in the first place. Someone who believed life mattered more than money. She turned and looked Richard directly in the eyes. "You're a monster. A man who forgot that every life in this hospital is someone. That boy who's dying has a father who loves him, a mother who prays for him, a future being stolen by your greed. And you're so lost in your numbers that you can't even see it." She left the office, closing the door with definitive force. Ellen ran back to the emergency room. Without authorization, without complete medical support, without the resources she truly needed, she tried to do the impossible. She worked alone for hours, using compression techniques to stop hemorrhages, stabilizing fractures as best she could, administering intravenous fluids that her training allowed her to give without medical orders. "Come on, son," she whispered as she worked, tears running down her cheeks. "Stay with me. Your family needs you. Don't give up." But without the surgery he needed, without proper blood transfusions, without a surgeon directing the operation, Michael Harper simply didn't have enough resources to survive. His young body fought, but it was too damaged. At 10:15 p.m., after more than 2 hours of desperate effort, Michael Harper's heart gave its last beat. The monitors emitted that continuous, flat sound that all medical personnel dread. Ellen attempted cardiopulmonary resuscitation for 20 more minutes, refusing to accept the inevitable. But finally, exhausted and broken, she had to stop. Michael Harper, a 23-year-old young man who had worked all his life for a better future, who was his father's pride and his mother's hope, was dead. Ellen collapsed in the chair beside the bed. She cried, not as a professional but as a human being, facing the cruelty of the world. Then, with trembling hands, she dialed the number they had found in Michael's pocket. The emergency contact. Thomas Harper. Father. Thomas was watching television with Sarah when the phone rang. It was 10:45 p.m. Michael should be in his accounting class. He was only 3 months away from graduating. 3 months and everything would change for his family. Hello. He answered with tired voice. Is this Thomas Harper? Asked a female voice that trembled, that had clearly been crying. Thomas's heart leaped. Yes, this is me. Who's speaking? My name is Ellen. I work at Mason Memorial Hospital. I need to talk to you about your son, Michael Harper. Thomas's entire world stopped in that instant. What happened? Where's Michael? Ellen didn't know how to say it. She never got used to this call, never found the right words. Your son was brought to the hospital a few hours ago. There was an accident. He was hit by a car. Where is he? I'm coming right now. Is he in surgery? There was a terrible silence on the other end of the line. Then Ellen said the words that would destroy Thomas. There was no surgery, Mr. Harper. What do you mean there was no surgery? Thomas's voice was no longer hopeful. Your son arrived in critical condition. I did everything I could without surgical intervention. But his injuries were too severe. Without emergency surgery, without transfusions, without the medications he needed. Ellen's voice broke completely. I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry. I did everything possible. But without money, without payment capacity, the hospital had a policy. Thomas dropped the phone. Sarah screamed his name, but he couldn't respond. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His world, which a moment ago had been full of hope, had completely collapsed. Sarah picked up the phone and heard the words no mother should ever hear. Her scream pierced the night like a knife. It was the scream of a mother losing her only son, a pain so primal and visceral it cannot be described with words. They arrived at the hospital an hour later. Thomas drove like a possessed man, running red lights, his hands trembling uncontrollably on the steering wheel. Sarah sobbed in the passenger seat, repeating her son's name over and over, as if calling him could bring him back. Ellen waited for them in a private room, with red and swollen eyes from crying, with her uniform stained with Michael's blood. She told them everything without hiding anything. Richard's refusal to operate. The threat of dismissal. How she had worked alone for hours. How Michael's body was simply too damaged. He would have lived, Ellen said, her voice broken by guilt and rage. If they had operated on him when he arrived, if they had given him transfusions, if he'd had a surgeon, he would have lived. It wasn't incurable. It was simply that the hospital decided his life wasn't worth saving because he had no money. Thomas listened in silence, with fists clenched so tightly that his nails left bloody marks on his palms. Rage began building inside him like a storm, like a volcano about to erupt. He asked to see his son. They took him to the morgue where Michael's body was covered with a white sheet. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted that sheet. He saw Michael's face, pale, still, lifeless. He saw all the unrealized dreams, the future he would never live. He saw his only son, whom he had worked so hard to educate, now turned into a cold body in a morgue. Thomas put his hand on Michael's cheek, seeking warmth but finding only the cold of death. He leaned down and kissed his forehead. I'm sorry, my son. I'm so sorry. I should have done more. I should have had more money. I should have. But he couldn't finish. There weren't enough words for the pain. In that moment, something in Thomas burned completely. A rage so deep, so pure, so justified took hold of him. It was the rage of a father seeing his son dead unnecessarily, dead because a rich man had decided his life wasn't worth enough. I want to see Richard Mason, he said with dangerously calm voice. I want to see the man who killed my son. It was early morning, around 6:30 a.m., when they brought Thomas to Richard's office. The doctor was coordinating the shift change, completely uninterested in what had happened during the night. For him, the death of a patient without money was simply one less number in the registry. When he saw Thomas enter, dirty from the previous day's construction work, with red eyes from crying, with rage emanating from his body like visible heat, Richard didn't recognize him immediately. To him, Thomas was just another worker. Thomas entered slowly. His hands trembled. His breathing was deep and controlled, as if he were trying not to explode. "My name is Thomas Harper," he said, his voice low but clear. "Son of Philip Harper. Foreman for your father. I grew up with you, Richard. We were friends. We shared secrets under the oak tree at Hope Valley. Don't you remember me?" Richard looked at him, and for a moment something seemed to register in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the same indifference as always. "Harper," he said with the tone of someone vaguely recognizing a former employee. "You work in construction now, right?" Thomas felt the rejection like a stab. "My son died in your hospital last night." His name was Michael Harper. He was 23 years old. He was 3 months from graduating as an accountant. He was hit by a car. He arrived here in critical condition. And you told your nurse not to operate on him because he had no money. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expressions unchanged. "Are you blaming me for a patient's death?" "Harper, accidents happen. I can't save everyone. I can't lose money on cases without payment guarantee. It's basic economics." Basic economics. Thomas's voice began to rise. "My son wasn't a lost cause. The nurse said he would have lived if they'd operated. You had the resources here to save him." Richard stood up, showing irritation. "Look, Harper, I'm sorry about your son's death. It's genuinely sad. But many private hospitals function this way. I didn't invent the system. If your son had had money, he would have been saved." Then Richard said something that would destroy any hope of humanity in his words. "You worked on my father's ranch. Probably earned $50 a day. With that money, could you have paid for surgery costing thousands of dollars?" He stood and looked at Thomas directly. "This is the reality of the world, friend. Some are born with money, others without it. Your son was born without it. It's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to remedy nature's injustices." Thomas heard those words and felt as if something died inside him along with Michael. "You're a monster," he finally said, his voice now frighteningly calm. "A human being who has completely forgotten what it means to be human. But listen to me well, Richard Mason. Someday you'll understand this pain. Someday destiny will collect what you've done. And that day you'll remember this moment and these words. Is that a threat?" Richard asked with disdain. "It's not a threat. It's a promise from the universe. Karma exists, Richard. And sooner or later, we all pay our debts." Thomas left the office, leaving Richard there, a man who still believed he was invulnerable, that money would protect him from everything. But the seeds of destiny had already been planted. And soon, very soon, they would begin to germinate. 3 years passed since Michael Harper's death. 3 years during which the community never completely forgot the tragedy. There were protests, newspaper articles, public outrage. But Richard Mason remained untouchable, protected by his money and political contacts. Mason Memorial Hospital continued operating with the same relentless policies. Thomas and Sarah now lived in the shadows of grief. Sarah never fully recovered. Depression consumed her. Thomas worked to exhaustion, as if work could fill the void Michael had left. But nothing could. Some wounds never heal, we only learn to live with them. Richard, meanwhile, expanded his empire. He opened a second clinic in Nashville. His fortune grew exponentially. He had a son, Daniel, a 25-year-old young man born into absolute privilege. Daniel had grown up without knowing limits, without facing consequences, pampered to the point of irresponsibility. He drove expensive sports cars, frequented the most exclusive clubs, lived as if the world existed only for his pleasure. Before continuing with this story that makes us reflect on justice and destiny, I want to ask you a favor. If this tale is touching your heart, if it's making you think, leave me a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that make us reflect on life. Hit the bell to not miss any episode. And most importantly, share in the comments what you think about this story. Do you believe in karma? Do you believe actions have consequences? I'd love to read your opinions. Now then, let's continue with what destiny had prepared. The night of March 18, 2008, exactly 3 years and 3 days after Michael's death, Daniel Mason went out with his friends to celebrate a successful business deal of his father's. They drank at an exclusive Nashville bar. Expensive whiskey, French champagne, toast after toast. Daniel was completely drunk when he decided to drive his red Porsche back home. It was 2:30 a.m. The road was dark, winding through hills. Daniel drove at reckless speeds, laughing with his friends, music at full volume, accelerator pressed to the maximum. His vision was clouded by alcohol, his reflexes slowed, his judgment completely impaired. On a sharp curve, Daniel lost control. The car skidded violently, spun over and over, and finally crashed into an ancient oak tree. The impact was devastating. The driver's side was completely destroyed. Metal twisted. Glass shattered into millions of fragments. Daniel's friends, miraculously less injured, pulled him from the car. His left arm was almost completely severed from his body. His head bled profusely. He had multiple fractures. Massive internal hemorrhage. He was unconscious, barely breathing. They called an ambulance immediately. "It's Daniel Mason, son of Dr. Richard Mason, owner of Mason Memorial Hospital," shouted one of his friends on the phone. "We need help now." The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes. Paramedics worked urgently, recognizing the surname, knowing this patient would receive the best available care. He was taken directly to Mason Memorial Hospital, where Richard was notified immediately. When Richard saw his son on the emergency gurney, shattered, bleeding, on the brink of death, something inside him broke. For the first time in years, he felt genuine fear. Fear of losing his son. Fear of experiencing the same pain he had caused others. For 9 hours, Richard and a complete team of surgeons worked frantically to save Daniel. They used all available resources. Massive blood transfusions, cutting-edge technology, extremely expensive medications. They spared nothing. Money was no object. Only one thing mattered: saving Daniel Mason's life. And they succeeded. After 3 days in induced coma, Daniel opened his eyes. He was alive. Shattered, with a long road of recovery ahead, but alive. Richard cried. He cried with relief, with gratitude, with the joy of not having lost his son. But in those tears there was also something else. The beginning of a terrible understanding. During the days that followed, while Daniel slowly recovered, Richard couldn't sleep. He spent nights walking through the silent corridors of his hospital. One night, at 3 a.m., he found himself in front of the emergency room where Michael Harper had arrived 3 years earlier. He stood there, looking at that now empty room, and suddenly everything connected in his mind with devastating clarity. He saw the scene as if it were happening before his eyes. A 23-year-old young man, unconscious, bleeding, needing urgent surgery. A nurse begging for permission to save him. And he, Richard Mason, refusing because the boy had no money. His own son had arrived in the same condition. Traumatic brain injury. Massive internal hemorrhage. Multiple fractures. Exactly like Michael Harper. The only difference was the surname and the money. Daniel had lived because his father was rich. Michael had died because his father was poor. It was that simple. That cruel. That unjust. Richard sat on the floor of that hallway and cried like he hadn't cried in decades. He cried for Michael Harper, whom he had never known but whose death now haunted him. He cried for Thomas, his childhood friend whom he had betrayed in the most brutal way. He cried for the person he had become, a monster disguised as a successful doctor. Ellen found him there. She had returned to work at the hospital months earlier, still tormented by not having been able to save Michael. She approached cautiously. "Dr. Mason, are you all right?" Richard looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "Ellen," he said with broken voice, "my son almost died. Just like Michael Harper. And I saved him because I have money." How have I lived with myself knowing I deny others what I gave my own son? Ellen sat beside him on the floor. You've lived without looking in the mirror, doctor. But now the mirror is in front of you. The question is, what will you do with what you see? Those words resonated in Richard like thunder. What would he do? Could he change? Was it too late for redemption? During the following weeks, Richard constantly sought out Ellen. He asked her to tell him everything about that night, about how she had tried to save Michael, about his last moments. Ellen spoke to him with brutal honesty that Richard needed to hear. He would have lived, Ellen told him. If you had operated on him when he arrived, Michael Harper would be alive today. He'd be working as an accountant. He'd have a family. He'd have a life. But you decided his life was worth less than your payment policy. Richard absorbed every word like deserved blows. Then he did something he never thought he would do. He sought out Thomas Harper. He found Thomas at the same construction site where he had worked for years. Thomas, now 58 years old, looked 10 years older. His hair completely gray, his back bent from hard work, his eyes dulled by pain that had never left him. When he saw Richard, rage resurfaced instantly. His fists clenched. But Richard raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Thomas, I come to ask you something I don't deserve. Your time. Just listen to me for 5 minutes. If afterward you want me to leave, I'll go and you'll never see me again. Thomas looked at him with distrust, but something in Richard's face was different. There was genuine pain there, real vulnerability. He nodded briefly. Richard told him everything. Daniel's accident. How he had been saved because his father was rich. How that experience had awakened him to the horrible truth of what he had done to Michael. How guilt wouldn't let him sleep, how he saw Michael's face in his nightmares, though he had never known him in life. I'm not coming to ask for forgiveness, Richard said with broken voice, because I know there's no forgiveness for what I did. Your son is dead because of me. No words can change that. But I come to offer you something, a commitment to completely change Mason Memorial Hospital, to ensure that no other father loses his son for lack of money, and to honor Michael's memory in a tangible way. Richard presented him with a 20-page document. It was a detailed plan for complete transformation of Mason Memorial Hospital. New admission policy. All emergency patients would be treated immediately, regardless of payment capacity. An aid fund for families without resources. Complete retraining of medical staff in ethics and compassion. But there was more. Richard had established the Michael Harper Foundation, an educational fund that would pay complete university education for young people from working families. 100 scholarships every year, in perpetuity, financed by Richard's personal fortune. Additionally, Richard continued, his voice trembling, I want to establish a lifetime pension for you and Sarah. It's not compensation for Michael, because nothing can compensate for a life. But it's recognition that you shouldn't have to work yourselves to exhaustion for the rest of your days. Finally, Richard made the boldest request. I want you to be president of the board of directors of Mason Memorial Hospital, to have real power to oversee policies, to ensure we never return to the old practices. I need someone who will constantly remind me why we do this. Someone who carries Michael's memory in their heart. Thomas listened to everything in silence, tears running down his face. When Richard finished, Thomas closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he spoke with barely audible voice. Why now, Richard? Why did you need your own son to almost die to understand what I felt 3 years ago? Because I was a blind man, Richard responded. Blind from ambition, from greed, from believing myself superior to others. And the universe had to put a mirror in front of me so I could finally see the monster I had become. Your son paid the price for my blindness. And that debt can never be fully paid. But I can try to make his death mean something. To save other lives. To change the system that killed him. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Richard. He saw something he hadn't seen in decades. Genuine remorse. Real pain. A broken man who had finally learned life's hardest lesson. I accept, Thomas finally said. Not because I completely forgive you. Some wounds never fully heal. But I accept because I believe Michael would have wanted his death to have meaning. to save others, to change the world even a little bit. The two men who had been childhood friends, who had been separated by money and ambition, who had been brought to the breaking point by tragedy, embraced. It wasn't the embrace of complete reconciliation, because the damage was too deep, but it was the embrace of mutual understanding, of two men who had been shattered by life and who were now trying to build something better from the ruins. The transformation of Mason Memorial Hospital was total and definitive. The mandatory prior payment policy was eliminated. Social workers were hired to help patients without resources. An emergency fund for expensive treatments was established. All staff were retrained in an approach that prioritized life above any other consideration. Thomas assumed his role on the board of directors with the seriousness of a sacred mission. Every time there was a difficult decision, he reminded Richard and the team of the reason why these new policies existed. He always carried a photograph of Michael in his wallet, and when someone questioned the cost of treating poor patients, Thomas simply showed that photograph. "This is Michael Harper," he would say. "My son. He died because this hospital decided his life wasn't worth saving. As long as I'm here, no other father will experience that pain." The Michael Harper Foundation began changing lives immediately. In its first year, 100 young people from working families received complete scholarships. Many became doctors, nurses, social workers, determined to honor the memory of the young man whose death had made their opportunities possible. Daniel Mason, Richard's son, was also transformed by the experience. His recovery was long and painful. Months of physical rehabilitation, years of therapy. His left arm never recovered its full strength. But something deeper changed in him. His perspective. His father told him the complete story of Michael Harper. Daniel understood that he had lived only because his surname was Mason, while Michael had died because his surname was Harper. That understanding haunted him, motivated him, transformed him. Daniel became a social worker, dedicating his life to helping the most vulnerable. He worked at the foundation bearing Michael's name, connecting needy families with resources, being a voice for those who had no voice. Richard dedicated the last 15 years of his life to this redemption mission. He never again measured success in terms of money. Mason Memorial Hospital became a model studied in universities across America. A hospital that was compassionate and still financially sustainable. When Richard died in 2023, at 78 years old, he did so in peace. Not because he had erased what he had done, but because he had dedicated every remaining day of his life to trying to repair it. At his funeral, hundreds of people came to pay respects. Many were beneficiaries of the Michael Harper Foundation. Many were patients who had been saved by the hospital's new policies. Thomas, now 73 years old, gave the eulogy. Richard Mason was many things in his life, he said with firm voice. He was a friend, then a stranger, then an enemy, and finally again a friend. I can't say I completely forgave him, because the pain of losing Michael never disappeared. But I can say I saw his transformation. I saw a man who committed a terrible mistake and dedicated the rest of his life to amending it. And thanks to that transformation, hundreds of lives were saved. Thousands of young people received education. The system that killed my son was changed. That's legacy. That's redemption. And that's what Michael would have wanted. The Michael Harper Foundation continued growing. 30 years after his death, more than 50,000 young people had received educational scholarships in Michael's name. Mason Memorial Hospital treated all patients with equal dignity, regardless of payment capacity. The model was replicated in dozens of cities across America. At Hope Valley Ranch, the ancient oak tree where Richard and Thomas had sworn eternal friendship still stands. Around it was built a monument with a bronze plaque that tells the story of Michael Harper, the young man whose unjust death changed a system, transformed a man, and saved thousands of lives. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, hundreds of people gather under that oak tree. Among them are doctors, nurses, social workers, teachers, all connected by an invisible thread, the memory of a young man who died too soon, but whose legacy continues transforming the world. This story teaches us that no life is worth more than another, that money can buy many things but should never be able to buy the right to live, that actions have consequences, and that the universe has mysterious ways of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn. But it also teaches us something more hopeful, that it's never too late to change. That redemption is possible if we're willing to pay the price. That even from the greatest tragedy can emerge a legacy of transformation. May we each day have the wisdom to treat everyone with the dignity they deserve, before life teaches us that lesson the hardest way.